Yeah. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our panel, Thinking Arts and Culture Out of the Box, that is taking place. Sorry, Nadir, I'm gonna have to mute you. I think, yeah, it's okay. So, hello everyone again. Welcome to our panel, Thinking Arts and Culture Out of the Box, that is taking place as part of Istanbul Fringe Festival 2021 hybrid. I'm Zeynep Uğur, Culture Policy Director of Istanbul Fringe, and this panel aims to engage a collective discussion to explore alternative ways of thinking arts and culture with the participation of pioneer researchers, I would say. And I'm more than happy to host today Pascal Gielan, Professor of Cultural Sociology at University of Antwerp and the founder of Culture Commons Quest Office, and Karen Zions, Assistant Professor and Queen's National Scholar in Creative Industries in the Global City in Queen's University. Actually, this panel takes as a starting point the need to revisit and question commonly accepted notions that frame our thinking of arts and culture, such as sustainability, accessibility, inclusiveness, social change, diversity, creativity, and sometimes these notions circulate to describe very different cultural contexts and may be emptied from their meaning. They are sort of taken for granted even and applied in a top-down sort to different contexts. Thus, we face the risk of imposing some frameworks on lived experiences and overshadowing what is really happening in the field. And today we will hear two researchers who conducted and are conducting fieldwork and invite us to rethink arts and culture sphere with the notions that come up from observed reality in the field. And some questions that we will follow will be: how do different artistic and creative productions reappropriate and transform the meaning of the notions that we use? What are the new practices challenging these notions? And can we find an alternative grammar? So we decided just before the panel that as I think that in this Zoom we have a small group, I will address the word to Pascal Gielan and Karen Zions. And during their presentations, if you do have questions, don't hesitate to ask your questions and engage in a discussion, please. So I think we can start with Pascal Gielan, who has seminal works on the field with his research around communism. So I'm gonna leave the floor to you, I think, Professor Gielan.
Thank you for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. I just decided, I think half an hour ago, to prepare a PowerPoint presentation because I didn't know very well the format, but I will share them with you. But please don't take it as a kind of monologue or lecture. When you have questions, immediately raise your hand or whatever, how it goes, or unmute your mic and ask me questions, and we can start a discussion. I think it's more productive than just classical lecturing, but I will see. It's just a brief PowerPoint to explain some general concepts I'm working for the last 5-6 years now, and doing research on, and the main one is, I'm looking if I can, share it. Do you see it? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So this lecture, or this talk is based on research what I've done, and what I exactly try to tackle here is the difference between art institutions and what I call art constitutions, and how they developed. And this whole idea of constitutions is based on ideas of the Constitutional Museum, which I'm working now on together with different museums in Europe. And this whole idea of a constitutional museum is based on principles for me of the commons. So I just try to explain briefly where this comes from, this notion, what does it mean in theory and in practice. And then I will give some examples where I can detect this practices. So first of all, maybe, and this is a very blunt, brief historical overview, but that's always how I try to explain the relationship between art, culture, and the city. But the city, I mean the polis, society in general. And I don't go in depth to this theoretical distinction between strategy and tactics. It comes from Michel de Certeau and Place and Space. But I will immediately zoom in this relationship. And I think classical 19th century, and I have to say, I really speak from an Eurocentric perspective, how institutions were built here. But what we see there was arts institutions, in fact, were placed in monumental buildings. They represented the nation state, that's the classical canon. They were strategically placed in a certain place, in a fixed place in cities. How developed was what we all know from already from the end of the 1950s. There was a lot of opposition against those institutions. They need to democratize in general, need to break open. They need to have more horizontal structures, etc. So there was a kind of fight against those institutions, not only the museum, but also theaters, against this kind of bourgeois culture. And so this happened it culminated, I think, in the 1970s. In a way, you could see that starting from the let's say the late of the 1980s, somebody said in an interview with me, Rem Koolhaas, by the way, the situationists won. What he meant by that was, of course, they didn't won in their ideology, but in fact, what we saw nowadays that the city was and institutions were broken open. They were more made in a way horizontal. And this is the moment when the whole discussion is about postmodernism, difference between high and low culture. But exactly at that moment, the creative city was invented. I always take as a symbolic moment for that when Tony Blair, was soon Prime Minister of the UK, embraced Bono of U2 for the screens. This is the start of it's not cultural policy anymore, it's creative policy for economical reasons. This is also the whole rhetorics of Richard Florida, the rise of the creative class and know your city. So in fact, culture becomes and art becomes creativity and part of a creative industry, which is a strategy. It is really strategically top down, placed in certain places. And this is also for me very interesting. Just like the monumental city, there are certain places in the city or in society, there can be creativity and not another place. So it is really framed as a strategy, as a policy plan. And we know nowadays a lot of, it's also the reason why I call it, not only creative city, but also creative repressive city. Because what we see a development that's very interesting to see of this policy in the 90s. Most of the time, it starts with left-wing politicians, mayors, like Tony Blair, Labour, also not mayor, but a prime minister, and they try to cultivate for market economical reasons this kind of new creativity in the city, build museums also, etc. But at the end of the, or in the beginning of the 2000s, most of the mayors were replaced by very conservative neoliberal politicians who make the very strange combination. I have it here also. I live in the city of Antwerp in Belgium. A very strange combination of a kind of repressive politics, zero tolerance, no drugs, and at the same time they embrace still this creativity. Yeah? So you get a very, very strange mixture of those two. And the response to this is what I call the common city, or are mostly artists, creators who want to escape from this economical logic, and they try to invent other things. And so this is, for me, in a way, just in a blunt historical way, to say this is the moment where we're in. We are still in this kind of creative repressive city situation, but artists try to find ways, and also activists try to find ways to get out. And that's what I call commons. I just try to explain what this commons is about. By this I favor of this picture because I use it always to explain where the commons, where the origin of the commons is, and where we can see it in society. This is a work of Recetas Urbanas. This is a Spanish activist architect collective. And this, what they built here in this tree, the sculpture, is in fact a shelter for the homeless. But they built this here exactly because you cannot, they detected in law that there are no regulations what says what you can do between the leaf of a tree and the root of a tree. So this is exactly, this space is what they call an illegal space. It's not illegal, it's not legal, it's something in between. And I just show this, and so it's also between creativity and criminality. It's somewhere in between. It's an invention or something like that. And this is exactly where commons organizations start, in the kind of illegal zone. In between, they don't know yet. It's not legalized. It's in between. This is for me very important. It starts with the civil space. I don't go in depth to that, but what for me is important is at a certain moment people do something. They build, for example, a school or an art institution. Can be different things. Illegal. They build it for people to come in. And then always is the question, for example, take the example of the school, because it's a good example. People say we need education here at the place, so we build a school. But then always comes the moment that you see that, yeah, and who can come in now? We have only 25 seats for children to come to the school. And then the whole discussion of common starts. Who can come in and who not? It is common. We made it for the people, everybody, but we need to do a selection. And then the whole idea of commons start. That's the main principle. So, but and then also the whole idea of constitutional praxis starts, and it's here Hannah Arendt saying a little bit the same of the constitutionalists. So she says those who get together to constitute, to need a government, are themselves unconstitutional. Right? They are outside the law. They make the law, but they are outside the constitution. Otherwise, you cannot be a constitutionalist. And this is the typical situation in which commoners or people who make commons organization are all in. So they try to make regulations for themselves, rules for themselves, but you can only do this when you are, in a way, outside the law. Yeah, or in between regulations. And you try to fight, of course, that those regulations will be accepted or at least will be allowed by a government or even a market system, etc. But there's always this, you invent your own regulations. And this is very important principle of the commons. Maybe just briefly, what is commons about? And You need a commonwealth. I show here l'Asilo. It's a huge theater in Napoli, in Naples, in Italy. And what is there, the commonwealth? It is the space. It is the building, but the common pool resource can be different things. It can be natural water, it can be cultural resources, creativity, language, etc. But here it's this building. Commoners are people. That's the second thing you need to have a commons. People who want to share this. That's the main thing. And you need some commoning principles. And most of the time they are radical democratic. You see here, in fact, in l'Asilo here in the picture, this is the direction. This is the direction of this theater. They come together every Friday afternoon and they decide the programming. Okay? And in this circle, there are people who are very well-known directors, art directors of Netflix series, but also people of the local carnival. Okay? And they discuss about the building every week again. Okay? So this is a typical commoning situation. So it's radical democratic about the cooperation, the management of those common pool resources. And the common pool resource here is, in fact, the building. And what you also need is a kind of belief system. I call it the ideology. That's why I call communism. And I don't use ideology in a kind of wrong, in a kind of bad sense or negative sense as something you try to mislead people with or something like that. You really need a belief system to get drive also in this system. And that is in communism very much the belief that culture is the base of society and not economy is the base of society. In that sense, it's the opposite of two other ideologies, which are also ideologically the opposite, neoliberalism and communism. But what communism and neoliberalism share is, in fact, that economy is the base, or the market is the base in neoliberalism of a society. What commoners do is they switch to say, no, culture is the base. And what is culture about? It is about giving new meanings to, for example, economy, to politics. So they really believe in this system. Just to go blunt, so they put Marx on his head. They say what is the substructure and what is the superstructure. They reframe it. They say everything starts with giving meaning to things, and then you can reframe, for example, economy, politics, etc. But they put also this guy on his head. This is Hayek. In fact, much more important figure. Nobody recognizes it most of the time when I show this picture, not because it's upside down, but because they don't know. But he is much more influential than Marx. He was really the inventor of neoliberalism and the whole system in which it functioned. But I follow more this guy is Gramsci, better known, because he exactly says this. He says he says hegemony is a cultural project also. It's about culture, and he tries to see much more a kind of symmetry or interaction between the superstructure and the base in the society. Just briefly, this is my almost last slide, and then I come with some examples. So what is this commons about? It is a third space between the market and the state, but there are also a lot of interactions between those three spaces. But it is, as I said, cultural based, so it's a matter of a culture of redefining, re-signifying economy and social relationships in society. So for me, it's also very important, I think, to relate that it's not only about autonomy of art or something like that. It's really about thinking also, not only thinking about artistic autonomy, it's really about thinking how to organize yourself autonomous in a society. So it's much more about the organization of art. So you can even make, for example, an abstract painting or a white canvas. That's not the point. So the message or the political message or something like it is not the point. It is how it is organized. in a society is the meaning of it. And for me also, but we can go on to this later, it's beyond communities, it's beyond identities. What I mean by that is it's not like the monumental city I showed before, where you see that art is organized in a nation state context and where it is related to an identity of a nation state, the people, etc. Commons is about sharing a space. That's the main thing. If everybody agrees to share the space, you don't need to share the identity. And I try to explain this now very briefly by, let's start with this example for me, the left side on the screen. This is an art organization in Amsterdam. It's called Splendor, musicians, 50 musicians. And they exist already for 7 years. They share this building also. And those 50 musicians can use this building for free to organize concerts, etc. And I take them as an example because they have only one rule. First of all, they exist now 8 years already, I think. They had never one meeting with the 50s. So they have never, they only have one democratic thing. That is, they have a digital agenda and they can discuss the time slot they can have for sharing this building. And they have one very important rule. They never discuss artistic quality. So they are not a kind of artistic collective or something like that, because you see in a lot of collectives, especially in the 70s, they break when they start to discuss their artistic identity. So the only thing they share is the building, not their identity. That's what I make clear, try to make clear. And then starts to function. L'Asilo, I gave the example already. And maybe last one, again, Recetas Urbanas. This is a school they built on a square. It looks mobile because it's, again, in this illegal space. You cannot build a building there. That's why they build it mobile like that. But so just, I stop here because I've said already a lot. But I think the kind of main principles is in commons is that you share a space, that you avoid discussions about artistic quality, identity, that it is really about the interest in, I would say, logistics almost, of sharing, and that those organizations are the most sustainable, like L'Asilo in Napoli, like Splendor, etc. Yeah, maybe stop there. I will stop sharing also.
Thank you a lot, actually. I think it gave us many ideas to reflect upon and continue in our collective discussion. And actually, when we were founding Istanbul Fringe Festival in 2019, it was one of my inspirations, your work on the common city. And as I have this self-claimed title of Cultural Policy Director, which is not quite common in festivals, because I was doing my PhD at EHESS Paris in political science, and I was a researcher. I am still, I'm still a PhD candidate on the alternative theater scene in Istanbul, actually. And I was reflecting upon how we will really engage this festival, this international festival, with the local scene, how it will be reappropriated, etc. And I think we are totally in, it's maybe particularly in our cultural context, it makes sense that we are, I think, fighting for our common city in a certain way, because as what you said, and I'm going to try to link with Karen's work in this aspect. So in the global age that we're living in, the public space is under control of state surveillance and privatization and securitarian politics, public health politics now, and so on. And we have also the rise of what we may call populism, which advocates nativism. So people should remain with people that they share the same identity. The sameness is advocated. But maybe these kind of initiatives, they're advocating for celebrating being different, being diverse, and it's not the sharing the same traits as you show in your research, but it is an alternative way of being together, sharing the same space, and being in common. And I think it also, I see this link to seek for remaining international, remaining in public space, remaining in an artist-run logic, with the research of Karen on international theater festivals. Therefore, I would like to leave the floor to Karen to maybe add up on it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pascal. I really enjoyed just, being the recipient of that kind of historical arc from the monumental city to the creative city. And Zeynep, the comments you're bringing in about how, as we're seeing this shift from the monumental city to the creative city, of course, there are all of these really complex factors that you named around the rise of populism, the tumultuous times of the pandemic, and how this becomes inflected in how we gather or do not gather. So I think it feels like a really vital time to think about commoning, to think about what it means to common in the age of far-right mobilization, in the age of the very fracturing of gathering due to the pandemic. It's also, it feels very vital to continue thinking about commoning when so many people common within very prescribed digital platforms, where we're on these very mainstream digital platforms that are facilitating communication, but are doing so in very pre-formatted ways. And the kind of formats of commoning that Pascal brought to our attention are ones where, yes, people might be gathering in these very monumental historical spaces, but they're deciding the terms of that commoning, whether it's kind of non-hierarchical exchange, and there's a little less wiggle room in those digital contexts, right? Such as Twitter, such as Facebook, such as Instagram, where people are finding creative and tactical modes, but it's again pre-formatted. I'll just set up my slide from here. I just have a very few number of slides. I know I emailed it to you, Zeynep, but I'll just share screen, and I'll just say hello here from southeastern Ontario in Canada, and I'm hailing to you from Kingston, Ontario, which is on the territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe Indigenous people. So I will just share screen here. And again, I just have a very few slides. If this is correct, and then go into so yeah, I think some of what I'll be sharing, really dovetails nicely with Pascal's work. I'm just starting here with a quote from Joyce Rosario. And I'll just briefly talk about, my thinking around what I call second wave performing arts festivals. And the second wave describes smaller performing arts festivals that emerged in North America and Europe in the early days of the new millennium, of the 2000s. This second wave festivals are based in urban cores. They're artist-run festivals that carve a space apart from established regional playhouses and non-juried first come, first serve Fringe festivals. And in my interview with curator Joyce Rosario, whose work as former associate artistic director has been formative to the Push Festival in Vancouver, Canada, she describes the second wave in the following terms. When you consider that Push, the Push International Festival in Vancouver, came out of the same time period as TBA in Portland, Fusebox in Austin, Under the Radar in New York, we're all of a similar vintage, sharing a similar orientation, which I would say is about the relevance of the festival in society today. So so I talk about how that desire for relevance often manifests itself as an attachment to the city in which festivals take place. Within the so I've thought a lot about the Push Festival in Vancouver, and they've done some really beautiful city-specific programming. And if you look at their festival editions, they're replete with works in which spectators are guided through streets, storefronts, and secret spaces. Audio walks or site-specific radio plays situated in and around Vancouver's downtown core. Sometimes spectators are led to hidden corners of the Vancouver Public Library, where they sit across from locals to hear their life stories. And these projects are created by choreographers, directors, and theater artists, and yet the majority don't take place in traditional performance venues. They move away from the tradition of creative and technical teams that design and manage a production. And they demand an interpersonal, not to mention physical, commitment on the part of audiences. So what I'm describing right now is how these second wave festivals brought with them their own aesthetic, the aesthetic of social practice that demanded from audiences a real kind of interpersonal commitment, and where the productions were defined by this kind of immateriality. It's what happened between people rather than a touring production on stage. So what's interesting about these participatory works in the second wave is that many of them are both site generic. So they are kind of festival ready. Many of them tour, and they're also site specific. So they meet a programming demand for works that can be molded to the spaces and stories embedded in the life of a city. And there are there's a whole set of companies in Europe and North America, from Rimini Protocol, Gob Squad, Blast Theory, Mammalian Diving Reflex, I'm just naming a few, that have adeptly developed transposable participatory projects situated in the public realm. These are not traditional touring productions so much as they are flexible formats and scenarios that can be adapted with the facilitation of local artists to the voices of a neighborhood or community. And one work that I've had the privilege of thinking a lot about is the 100% City Project. And here's one example of that 100% City Project. This is 100% Vancouver, which is part of Rimini Protocol's 100% City series. So I've come to think of 100% Vancouver as a city stage in which a local Vancouver theater company, Theater Replacement, used this transposable touring piece, the 100% City project that was created by Rimini Protocol, which has gone literally all over the world. They use that transposable scenario-based performance piece to create their version, 100% Vancouver, and create this really textured portrait of the city in collaboration with more than 100 local Vancouverites. And they did so within the heightened sentimental context of Vancouver's civic anniversary back in 2011, I believe, and just on the heels of the Winter Games in Vancouver, which, as you can imagine, was this very febrile moment in that mobilized a lot of creative city forces and also mobilized a lot of oppositional forces. So I've come to think of people-powered performances like 100% City and 100% Vancouver as events that have the potential to push international performing arts festivals into socialities that resemble movement building. So as we know, social movements describe how activists collectively mobilize around a cause to agitate for concrete change to policy and law. And while festivals don't gather large numbers of people to take direct action, they often gather large numbers of people in public to make all manner of real-time collective actions. So I'm not advocating for a like-to-like analogy between social movements and festivals, but I do think that reading the former onto the latter opens the possibility for the second wave to play a role in public life that stretches beyond a single production or annual festival program. So again, thinking of people-powered performances like 100% City as events that have the potential to push festivals into socialities that resemble movement building. So as we know, the long now of neoliberalism has not only led to market-led and state-imposed structural inequality, but it's also inspired revolt against that inequality through wave upon wave of progressive social movements. You know, we can think of, for example, in Canada, the Quebec student movement. We can think of the Arab Spring uprising that flashed across the region. We could think of the Euromaidan in Ukraine. We can look to the Occupy movement. And all of these movements that in many ways sprung up as a reaction to decades of structural inequality. And so these movements have had successes, and they've had very complex fallouts and failures as well. And I'm interested in the kind of expressive, creative strategies that came out of many of these movements. You know, despite the complex failures and fallouts of the Occupy movement, there are ways in which their aesthetic strategies, you know, continue to stick to my ribs as an intellectual and carried over into other movements that we saw, you know, bubble up after Occupy went into the middle distance. So, for example, something that I think is an expressive strategy that became associated with Occupy was the human microphone, which has its own kind of sonic quality, its own unique expressive strategy. some other the sort of public the sort of common libraries that struck up within the encampments, the common kitchens that came about in those temporary encampments. So all of those expressive strategies and all of those creative strategies, you saw them in the movements that followed post 2014. Former Occupy Toronto activist Camilla Petrick, as well as others, characterize these practices that I just described in terms of a prefigurative politics. So prefigurative politics is this notion that it's the conviction that the future can be collectively enacted now in the moment of protest or in the thick of organizing toward change. And I'll just repeat that. The prefigurative politics is the conviction that the future is collectively enacted now in the moment of protest or in the thick of organizing toward collective change. And I'll just very quickly point toward an example that I've thought about at length, which is mammalian diving reflex and their work with children and young people, particularly at the Lift Festival, so the London International Festival that is based in Tottenham. So in 2015, Lift partnered with Mammalian Diving Reflex, which is a Toronto-based company, and they established Lift and Mammalian Diving Reflex established a 6-year artist residency. And that residency saw its artistic director, Darren O'Donnell, move from Parkdale in Toronto's West End to Tottenham, which is, of course, in North London. And what's interesting is that these neighborhoods, Parkdale and Tottenham, they share a lot of parallels. They're both ethnically diverse. They're economically disadvantaged. They're kind of permanently on the cusp of being gentrified. And so Mammalian worked with co-director Alice Fleming to found the Uplifters, which is a youth collective that is part of Lift. So Mammalian first presented at Lift in 2010 with their work Haircuts by Children. And it's a project that's been tented at some 40 international performing arts festivals. And so the children that were initially part of Haircuts by Children, the local school children who were between 9 and 12, who basically were apprenticed in the art of cutting and styling hair and offering that haircut for free to festival-going publics. Some of those children in that very first iteration of Haircuts by Children continued, and that was back in 2006, the good old days. They continued to work with the company and they continued to work with Darren O'Donnell as teenagers. And they formed an art collective called the Torontonians. And that collective ran between 2010 and 2017. And that collective, the Torontonians, evolved into the Young Mammals. So now, as you can imagine, these young mammals, these young children who were apprenticed to cut and style hair for festival-going publics in these kind of early playful iterations of social practice that featured in these second wave festivals, they're now in their 20s. And they have been apprenticed in a whole other way. They've been mentored to pitch work to festival presenters, to collaborate with other youth collectives in festival contexts, to create their own socially engaged touring pieces, And very importantly, they've been charged with one day taking over and managing the company, Mammalian Diving Reflex. So this implicitly prefigurative organizational model functions, in Darren O'Donnell's words, with, quote, succession in mind. And that really shapes the working relationships between the adult mammalians like O'Donnell and the young mammals, because the knowledge that they'll one day own the means of artistic production fosters a lateral and collegial rather than instructive or hierarchical working relationship. Now I have a lot more to share, but I'm just very cognizant of the time, and so I'm just going to stop here, and I'll hopefully we can shift into a conversation from here.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Karen. Actually, we started a bit late, so if it's okay for you both, I think we can go on for 10 or 15 minutes. Is it okay for you?
Great. Yeah, I'll have to leave at about 11:10, but that's wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, I think
11:10 my time. Sorry.
No, I converted it to our time. Thanks a lot, actually, and I think it's very important of emphasizing also this relationship to the political field, which is transforming. And actually, it is the core of my PhD dissertation subject as well. How what you show, I think it gives us also some key elements to understand how the political and artistic aesthetic are being interviewed in our age. And maybe before we tend to think in a like more diverse, separated entities, but more and more they are interviewing and they are creating new forms of being political or being in society, maybe. Just to throw some ideas to engage the discussion, I think what you show also maybe makes us think about how these examples that you both cited create their singularities and stretch the existing field of arts and culture, because maybe we can talk about the conventional framework, maybe that's mostly defined by European Union grammar and framework for arts and culture. But these initiatives, I have the impression that they transform from below and create their own meanings of relating to the social and to the political. And also, actually, Pascal Guillain, you also talk about in your works that the past decade in Europe, there was this dream of a common market with free competition and frictionless mobility. Now that has turned into a problematic political name-calling and repressive politics. And maybe we can also think about how do these artistic initiatives and festivals defy these repressive politics, and how they claim their own singularity, resisting to this common market logic where everything and everybody is interchangeable, and artists just have to respond to some expected identities, I would say, like as we are talking in the context of Istanbul Fringe, as a Turkish artist in Europe, you have to perform this identity of victimhood and exist as an exiled artist because you're LGBTI, etc. And it's difficult to go beyond these identity politics, I will say. So just some ideas of your presentations, and I leave the ground to you.
Yeah, Pascal, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there are also comments or of people in the public, but if there are, please go. But I just, for me, one important thing is when you talk about arts, politics, and working with communities. I think one thing can be always problematic, and that's something what we know is, and we see this also with movements of the commons, they can be very easily used and abused by neoliberal governments. Especially in commons, you see this often, organizations at a certain moment. By the way, first thing, this is just an anecdote. The first political debate in Belgium about commons was organized by the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party is something else than in Canada here. So it's a right-wing political party. So, and why were they interested in the commons? Because they thought, of course, then we don't have to do it anymore. So, and this is always, I think, the pitfall, I think, for a lot of initiatives, festivals, etc., that at the end, and that's the old story we know, that they are taken in, for example, in process of gentrification, etc. So, and I think for that reason, it is very important, I think, as an artist or initiator of festivals or whatever collective artistic projects, to immediately also guarantee a kind of regulations which can be politically confirmed. I just used an example, Recetas Urbanas, what I mentioned before. They make always a protocol with the government that, for example, a sculpture or whatever, or a school, will be used always for the people. So they work with lawyers to make this deal. What I wanted to say, just in general, what I saw also in our research, too many people are too naive. and they are really in making this, and even this prefigurative politics, we have a lot of examples of that at the end they are encapsulated and closed in the system, and they just play their role. I had also interviews and discussions with Rimini Protocol about this, because exactly they were taking in the system at the end, and it's very difficult then to escape. So it is very important, I think, to define your conditions beforehand, and even fix them in regulations, which is boring stuff, right? It's with lawyers, it's with, but this is very important, I think, when we think about reorganizing things. But it is a general remark. It's a problem that I see everywhere in this context. Also, this ambivalence always. Just
yeah, I think it's the conundrum of the 20th and 21st century of how collective modes of being and non-hierarchical kind of lateral modes of being resist capture. And it is the kind of enduring conundrum, of course, of neoliberalism, because of the ways in which creative modes of expression, there is the kind of performative appearance of neoliberalism, actually, and this is going back to your talk, Pascal, the performative appearance of centering culture, of making culture front and center, hence something like Blair's Creative Britain. But of course, it is, as we know, that creativity is instrumentalized toward economic ends. And so how artists keep body and soul together within these systems of capture it's amazing how artists continue, I should say, to keep body and soul together within these systems of capture, part of it is that most artists are not trained in political thinking. They're trained through conservatories in which they're thinking about technique, in which they're thinking about how they lean into for-profit and not-for-profit industries when they graduate. And so many artists come to politics, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a political education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also one of the reasons why I'm convinced that a kind of just an artist collective or something doesn't function. I mean, in the sense, in the political sense, you really need to make a kind of heterogeneous organization with lawyers, with different kind of professions and of course who share in a way the same, let's call it ideology. I don't know, with the same vision, but want to construct it. I most of the time I use the as a metaphor, of course, the classical circus as the best way, where you have the director who also needs to negotiate with the mayor for the place to put where you have also the physiotherapist in it, where you also, so this where it's family, where it's also professionals. And this, I think this kind is much more interesting to think about the new institutions nowadays. But I think they really need to be heterogeneous. Otherwise, artists are too weak. I mean, to really dive into politics, I think. And some are not. They are very talented. But I mean, in general, I think this heterogeneous way of organizing is very important.
And no single artist is as an institution or a social movement. So what we put on the shoulders of artists is is particularly as thinkers who, personally, like art is like my religion. So what I put on the shoulders of artists is probably too heavy a load. And I'm really buoyed by looking at social movements like Black Lives Matter that have integrated creative, expressive strategies into their social movement and have moved from social movements to institutions that have been able to successfully mobilize, to distribute funds to different chapters, to different BLM chapters, for example. So it's also very interesting to see how social movements, leftist progressive social movements, I should say, have taken up the creative strategies that we see within, for example, performing arts festival contexts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Definitely. Mm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also important that you emphasize it's so heavy that we put all this responsibility on the shoulder of artists. It made me think of there's French researcher Olivier Neveu who has a book called Against Political Theater, because he argues that now as politics are failing, as the professional people who works in politics are failing, we seek to be saved by the artists. And like, it's not only art, but it's also the politics. And it's really weird interviewing sometimes as well. And but also the what you said about different organization models, I think maybe in the world, I hope after COVID, because there was this discussion, are we returning back to the normal? But actually the normal was not normal at all. So maybe we are in this period of reconfiguration of the organization of arts and culture field in a global scale. And we just had a panel actually on Monday with the new Director of Culture of Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality. And for the first time, this title is occupied by someone who's actually coming from the field. And we were seeking to find models in which we can all sit around the table as independent initiatives of Istanbul, and how we can form cultural policy together actually for the city. So I think it's also very important to be inspired from the other examples all around the world that you presented.
Yeah, it's certainly also with the former mayor of Napoli, but also in Barcelona with Ada Colau, you see this movement also where, for example, hackers become administrators and to break open also, to make open administration, etc. So I think these are really the places to look at nowadays, especially also how they, for me, it's very important in cities, how they try to combat or fight against real estate and privatization of spaces and how they try to re-win space of them. And they, yeah, it's a very interesting juridical game, but it's very sophisticated. But often artists play their very creative role in this kind of redefining space as a kind of artwork, for example, etc. And then they occupy the space and try to. But again, I think what we learned from Occupy movement is certainly occupying is important, but it needs to be structural. So you need also to think about how can you embed this kind of again in regulations, etc., but also in the heads. I mean, also really in the culture of people to reframe this.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a side note, to have also a kind of historical consciousness of what it means to even inhabit the word occupy, and you know, whose space we are actually occupying, particularly within contexts where that to say that you are occupying, even from a leftist progressive perspective, means that you are stepping foot on Indigenous territory. And there wasn't a lot of consciousness around that within the Occupy movement. So again, I think that's part of like perhaps a political and historical education that needs to happen when people step into these spaces and occupy these mantles. Thank you for such a wonderful and stimulating hour together.
Thank you, actually. But yeah, we kind of improvised. I think we have to wrap up as you have to leave. But I think it's a very important subject to discuss, and I think that it will inspire a lot of people who are working in this field in Istanbul, I know. And I hope that we're going to deepen this conversation. And hopefully, in an after COVID world, I would love to organize a physical meeting with you in Istanbul with Istanbul audiences.
Oh, that would be amazing.
I'd like to come back.
Yes.
Yes, Pascal, so lovely meeting you. Nevra, hello. And Zeynep, conversation to be continued.
Okay.